All right. I see many conversations going on. Just a heads up, we are now live to start the meeting this evening. I want to thank those of you in attendance. We've got a good crowd here tonight, and I suspect a good crowd around their TVs back in your respective homes. Thank you for watching. And a good crowd around the table tonight representing the school board and the city council and others, including a couple of guest speakers that were very kind to come here this evening for a work session that a few folks, I know Councilor Dwyer and others helped get these two esteemed speakers here tonight. Before we begin, just a couple of quick notes. And I know the Vice Chair, Nancy Clayburgh of the school board, is here as well. I know you wanted to mention that a few members are going to be a little late.
Yes, I just wanted to let everybody know that our board chair, Kent LePage, our superintendent, Bob Lister, and our business administrator, Steve Bartlett, they are at a meeting that they tried to rearrange and they couldn't. So they will be here about 7 o'clock, 10 after 7, and they apologize for being late.
I appreciate that. And also, I know there are a few members of the City Council unable to be here this evening for a variety of reasons. I apologize in advance. I also have to leave early this evening. But obviously, between rebroadcasts, it's one of the strengths of being able to do that, and I'm sure we all that miss any part of this will be sure to catch the remainder in short order. With that, we have two presentations this evening. Our first is Dr. Arthur Marylander from Dartmouth Medical School. Very esteemed, and we're really happy to have you here. And I figured that probably the best person to make the full introduction would be Councilor Dwyer.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. For those of you who followed the work of the JSAC committee, the Joint School Advisory Committee, you know that at several points the committee wanted to connect with Dr. Marylander and bring him to a meeting with the committee. And in a minute, I think you'll understand why they thought that was so important. And given timing and given how fast that committee was working, that never worked out during the life of the committee. So we thought that it would be particularly important to try to bring him to the community tonight to kind of continue that dialogue that started at the JSAC. So let me just tell you a little bit about him. Dr. Marylander is at Dartmouth Medical School, and his specialties are child and adolescent behavioral health and psychiatry. He received his PhD in counseling psychology from Notre Dame in 1993, and then came to Dartmouth for a fellowship, a postdoc fellowship in neuropsychology. What brings him here to us is that he was co-principal investigator of the Commission on Children at Risk. That was a national commission sponsored by youth-serving organizations as well as national philanthropies and Dartmouth Medical School. And what was interesting about it is that it was a group of children's doctors along with research scientists, youth professionals, and mental health workers, all looking at adolescents, looking at contemporary adolescents and the kinds of supports that that adolescents need. The commission published their findings in a book called Hardwired to Connect, the New Scientific Case for Authoritative Communities. While he's not here tonight to talk about the committee, I would urge you to look any of this up in line, because for those of us who've worked all of our careers with children and in education, it's really a who's who. It's the James Comer and Robert Coles and Barry Brazelton and Alvin Poussaint, all the people who we've all studied and whose theories and research have really informed child and adolescent development. So he's going to talk to us about what that committee came forth with out of the investigation on what are the bases for child well-being currently in society. And that seemed like a really important foundation to the JSAC. I think it's really important. It's really information that we all need to pay attention to, no matter where we end up with locating a school. So, Dr. Maryland.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me? It's quite an honor to be here in Portsmouth. What a tradition and history you folks have. I'm really honored to be here. I guess one of the things that people often ask is, what does a neuropsychologist have to do with school locations? And I think it's a reasonable question to ask, or reframed, how is it I even became interested in the local school issue? And Actually, my early career was in education. I have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in education. I've been a consultant to several school districts in the region. And then we did the Hardwired to Connect program, but most recently was the Kearsarge experience, where they were moving their middle school out to the hinterlands. And so I was very involved in that, and it was through that I guess my name sort of floated around, and Eric contacted me to see if I would help out here. So I was really glad to, because we did put together quite a bit of research and information for that. So it really wasn't initially as a neuropsychologist, but the brain has connections to lots of things. So in the beginning, and this is the start of the Hardwired project, as Councilwoman Dwyer was mentioning, some of my colleagues and I were sitting around and sort of bemoaning the fact that we would see kids and we would send them back to sort of the same old situation. We'd do evaluations, we'd come up with great treatments, and we'd send them back to chaotic families, chaotic communities, and see them back again with no change. And when you do that for year after year after year, it starts to become depressing, to say the least. We were starting to wonder if maybe it was our treatment, what was the issue, and what we kind of came to was that our waiting lists were just really too long, that we kept seeing statistics that 1 out of every 4 adolescents is currently at serious risk of not achieving a productive adulthood despite our best efforts, that 21% of U.S. children between 9 and 17 have diagnosable mental or addictive disorders despite our treatments, that the current generation of young people is more likely to be depressed and anxious than their parents were, and that 20% of students, and this has gone up, by the way, have seriously considered suicide, and this was back in 2003. So clearly there was a crisis going on in adolescence and childhood in general, and we felt like we were the Dutch folks with their fingers in the dam trying to hold back this tide, and not being successful at all. And so a couple of philanthropies got in touch with us. We actually had some connections, and they said, well, why don't we take a look at this, and why don't we study it? And so what came out of it was the Hardwired to Connect project. It was funded by the Institute for American Values and the YMCA, and we looked at sort of the risk model that's used a lot in medicine and social work, and what are the common underlying factors that seem to relate to psychosocial dysfunction in children and adolescents. I did 4 major literature reviews on pregnancy, violence, substance abuse, and school dropouts, looking at thousands and thousands of articles. We held a conference at Dartmouth where Tom Insole and James Comer and all of the big shots came in, and we discussed the issues. And we produced the document that referred to. What we came to was that in the midst of unprecedented material affluence, the mental and behavioral health of U.S. children was deteriorating, and we were kind of concerned that we weren't thinking about this in the proper way. That part of the issue was that we really weren't recognizing some of the broader factors, some of the broader environmental issues that were contributing. From our risk model, we look at individuals, we analyze them, we assess them, we pull them apart, and put them back together again in our own minds, but we miss the big picture consistently, and that's what we sort of concluded was one of the problems with our current approach to mental and even physical health. So I say in quotes here, the new scientific case, because I'm not sure it's new, and it just was one of the things that the promotionists came up with. But the mechanisms by which we become and stay attached to others are biologically primed and increasingly discernible in the basic structure of the brain. This was sort of the bottom line, that attachment to others is hardwired in each of us, and that it's in that process that lots of things unfold. that when you look at brain development, the way the brain sort of works, and I'll try to keep the brain stuff as simple as possible, that brains develop, individual brains develop in the context of a relationship. First of all, of course, with the mother and the father, but it gradually, the sphere of influence grows outward, and it is the interactions between the environment and the brain that make all the difference in the world. This relational context can be either growth facilitating or growth inhibiting. So bad environments hurt, good environments help. It's pretty simple. This development imprints the developing brain either a resilience, so that we get some kids who seem to be able to survive incredibly bad things, or vulnerabilities. So nurturing environments, or the lack of them, actually affect gene transcription. That is, the environment that an individual brain grows up in, the forces that influence that brain will have an impact on how the genes switch on and off and how they work. We have lots of examples of this from rat studies. It's pretty amazing, some of the work that's been done showing how the parenting of rat pups actually influences their health, their capacity to respond to stress, and other kinds of environmental influences. So the importance of parenting and nurturing is, we know that's clearly important, but we can test it and we can manipulate it in animals. So environmentally engineered traits, in part because they become expressed genetically, can be passed then from generation to generation. So this effect of positive parenting, positive nurturing, actually has effects generations down the line. You'll have to take my word for it. The studies are pretty long and complex, but it's quite amazing. So social context can alter genetic expression. A social environment can change the relationship between a specific gene and the behavior associated with that gene. So we've moved really pretty far away now from the is it nature, is it nurture debate, and now we're looking at how nature and nurture interact. And there's a continual interaction that goes on between them. So much so that even if you start out well and then change the environment, you have dramatic effects. So it isn't just, when we say it's hardwired, the hardwiring is not permanent. What we mean is that everybody has a predisposition to have a relationship, and to have good relationships is what we intend, but it's what happens through time that makes all the difference. So that sort of brings us to adolescent brains, and adolescent brains are really interesting, and because the adolescent time frame from 11 to 18 is when lots of things are going on in the brain. Well, lots of things are going on in the brain all the time, but what seems to happen is that from birth to about age 11, 12, 13, the brain is actually adding neurons all the time, and a huge increase in neuronal development through that time period. But adolescence, things start to shift, and everything starts to focus on the frontal lobes, which is where we have these really important things of memory, voluntary motor behavior, impulse control, decision-making, planning, and other higher order processing. So these are the things that we all complain about adolescents, that they don't do properly, but it's exactly what they're working on at this point. So it's not too surprising that they're not getting it totally correct. One of the maxims is that you have to make mistakes to learn, and the brain needs to experience different kinds of things. The problem is when you're an adolescent, you're relatively big, relatively strong, moving pretty fast, and have access to all kinds of high-tech stuff. And so making mistakes with those things, the cost is a lot higher than a much smaller individual playing with, smaller toys. Let me go back. So one of the things that turns out to be the case with adolescents is that they actually need to push the envelope. They have to have stimuli, and this stimulation is necessary in order for their brains to develop. Now, the trick is, how do we give them the stimulation that they need without getting them or having them get themselves in trouble? And it's pretty interesting to do cross-cultural research and to see how other cultures handle this. And there are all sorts of ritualized and controlled environments for adolescents to express themselves and to try things out. American culture is really struggling with this right now. Is part of the approach is, if they're out of sight, they're out of mind. Let them do what they want. Get them out of our sight because they're bothering us. What they really need is to be able to try new things, to have lots of stimulation, but to do it in a way that is not going to get them in a lot of trouble. So what's really going on here from a social context is that the adolescent brain no longer needs mommy there for stimulation. They need the societal forces there for stimulation. They actually need to have relationships with other people, and they need to experiment with those relationships. They need to experiment with their own roles. They need to try out new ways of being. And of course, as a parent, that's very disturbing when they come in with their clothes and piercings and those things. But that's part of what they need to do. So parents become less of a direct or immediate influence, while the social structure becomes the more proximal, important influence on kids. And there are several studies that parental, so mom and dad, you don't feel left out, that parental behaviors actually have a lot of impact on adolescents, but it's not as direct as you think. They actually do internalize a lot of the values, but they need to try new things out. So as they get older, they often return to the values that you tried to give them. But there is this period where the brain actually needs to try out new things. There's also some evidence that suggests that the teen brain needs increased stimulation from what adults would need. There's some medication trials showing that the amount of medications an adolescent brain actually needs to get the same effect as an adult brain is more. So it seems to make sense that this extreme need for stimulation is really just a part of what the adolescent brain needs to do. So taking all of this together, the hardwired to connect, the research studies on the adolescent brain, we come to some pretty clear conclusions. So I've just raced through about 300 textbooks here. Humans are hardwired to have relationships. These are the take-home points. Parental relationships are absolutely key. But parental relationships take place in the context of larger social organizations, our communities. And that's important because adolescent development requires social interactions as they move into adolescence, and it's important that there be supervision of adolescent behavior, but probably not by parents. I mean, parents do supervise, but as adolescents differentiate themselves from parents, they need to be in a social environment, so it becomes more of the community's responsibility to provide some supervision. And this is an area, as I said, that I think we really struggle with. So the hardwired to connect conclusion that the cause of American childhood crisis is really that there's a lack of connectedness for adolescents, a lack of close connections to other people, and we also found that there's a lack of connections to moral and spiritual meaning. Now, this isn't for every child, but sort of across the board, the modal finding. So connecting, teenagers need to connect, and they need to connect with different people, different ideas, and different values. So in large measure, we said that what's causing the crisis is a lack of connectedness, and this means connections to other people. Well, communities are people, and this is where the school issue, I think, really starts to take off. Communities are how you want to define them. They can be, a school can be a community, a town can be a community, a nation can be a community. Humans are endowed with the neurological equipment to manage social interactions, so we need to have these communities, however we want to define them. And we need to have these social interactions from the very beginning. What this has been talked about in some of the literature is a concept called social capital. And social capital is the tangible thing that occurs in everybody's life that's not formal, that's very informal. The things such as saying hello to your neighbor, offering goodwill to people, sympathy, general social intercourse, and the sort of glue that kind of holds us together. Simple things like when I drop my kids off at school, seeing other kids and just nodding at them so they see me and I see them. That's social capital. We know who each other is and don't know the names, don't need to. Having coffee at the coffee shop and chatting with somebody for a few minutes. Robert Putnam wrote a book called Bowling Alone in 2001, and what he has tracked is that there's been a tremendous loss of social capital in the U.S. Over the last 50 to 75 years. And it's pretty interesting to note that we can all feel good that New England is one of the highest social capital areas in the country, but even in New England, we've seen a loss of these informal groups, these sort of connections that people have, and he's tied some of it pretty directly to the increase in TV watching. So it's not too unusual to see that technology has had a negative impact on some of our social behavior. So it's clear that kids need all these connections. They need to be connected to their peers, to adults, to institutions, to values, to communities. What this means is that they need to be seen. It's not enough to just have them there. We need to see kids. They're part of our communities. They need to be members. And what's really interesting is to watch adolescents watch adults. They act like they're not, but they're very observant about what is going on in the social world. And so they need adults around because part of their task is to learn how to be an adult. And if they don't have communities of adults around, they don't have models for how to be. And it's absolutely critical for them to see how they're supposed to be, because remember, parents are less and less of an influence. They're still important, but they want to see how other parents do it. They want to see how their friends' parents do it. They want to see how shopkeepers behave. They want to see how policemen behave. They want to be a part of the community, although they often act like they don't want to be. The problem is when they're left to their own devices, what happens? And because of this intense need for, let's call it thrill-seeking behavior, when they're left to their own devices, they engage in a lot of thrill-seeking behavior and they make mistakes. And that's when people get hurt. So studies of brain function show that the adolescent brain is developing its ability to understand and process social information. That's what the frontal lobes do. That's what's going on for adolescents. Their frontal lobes are really developing. And developmentally, they're differentiating from their nuclear family. So adolescents need to observe. They need to see the social world. And if they don't, what's the default? Leaving them to be with their peers, be supervised by their peers. Oops. Yep. I'm going backwards here. Sorry. Letting them have videos and movies. That's their interaction. Having teachers only. Having adults who tolerate them. It's interesting to see. I'm going to get to this business of other school stories in a little bit. So adolescents actually need to be supervised. That's part of our responsibility as adults, is to pay attention to adolescents. It's no surprise that children do fewer drugs, they engage in less risky sex, they do less violence when there are adults around. Not just watching them, but around, in their environment. And understand that supervision is not just watching and having eyes on. Supervision involves arranging an environment so that it is safe, so that it is protected. So that sort of brings me to, well, what is an authoritative community? What is an arranged environment that might be helpful? And this is some of our final conclusions, and I have to apologize for this label, authoritative communities. We got a lot of criticism for this, but there was a reason for using it that I'll explain. The term comes from the parenting literature, an author by the name of Baumrind, and authoritative parenting involves behaviors that include appropriate limit setting, communicating, and providing appropriate opportunities for autonomy. This type of parenting is very different than authoritative or authoritarian parenting, which sets lots of limits but does not communicate and does not provide for autonomy, or permissive parenting, which sets no limits and may or may not communicate. And in the parenting literature, you see really dramatic effects of children's behavior based on styles of parenting. So we thought that these were some pretty important concepts that maybe could be applied to a larger arena, such as a community. So authoritative communities are groups that live out the types of connectedness that our children increasingly lack. We listed 10 characteristics of authoritative communities. Social institutions that include children and youth, so it's not isolated. Treats children as ends in themselves, that's warm and nurturing, establishes clear limits and expectations for children. The core of its work is performed largely by non-specialists. That is, an authoritative community isn't all MSWs doing social work. It's normal parents. It's multi-generational. It has a long-term focus. It reflects and transmits a shared understanding of what it means to be a good person. It encourages spiritual and religious development. And it's philosophically oriented to the equal dignity of all persons and the principle of love of neighbor. So these were what we thought were important characteristics of strong communities. So why would we isolate kids? Why would we put them in schools out in the middle of nowhere? Kids are our responsibility. We have to be around them. We have to see them. In a sense, they're a community asset, and they belong to us. So sticking them away from us is not taking very good responsibility for them. Schools are important institutions. We need them in our community so that we can see kids. On a personal note, I drop my kids off at school every day, and just the ability to be able to see the other kids, see the teachers. I don't really speak to many people, but just to see the environment, I find important. And it's important that my kids know that I do that as well. Kids need to see adults and adult behavior. Kids need to participate in the community. And in the Kearsarge situation, this is one of the things that's really going to be limited as they move the middle school out away from town. Currently in the middle school kids go to nursing homes. They actually go to the elementary school next door and do tutoring. They have jobs in some of the local shops, very small jobs, and they help out. They go visit the police and fire. They walk right, down the street. So some of these things are really going to be limited. Being in the community means less busing, more walking, and one of the areas I was thinking of getting into, but I won't, was the epidemic of obesity, and people directly blame the increase in busing and the lack of walking to school for some of that. And sprawl, sticking schools out of town clearly increases sprawl, and I think we'll hear more about that. It's interesting that the National Clearinghouse of Educational Facilities came up with 6 design principles, and number 2 is that schools should serve as a center of the community. So this is completely appropriate with the Hardwired to Connect concept, that institutions be part of the community so that those people who are in the institutions are able to be a part of the community. So number 2, the learning environment should serve as a center of the community because it strengthens the community's sense of identity and coherence. It serves as a hub for the town. It meets communities' leisure and recreation and wellness needs. It's accessible to people of all ages, and encourage more active parental involvement in school activities. This is what the federal government is pushing. They see this as very important. It was also, interestingly, part of the New Hampshire school board website, but it disappeared during the Kearsarge debate. I don't know what happened. So a school should be part of the community for lots of different reasons. Not the least of which is economics, that kids in communities aren't just consumers, but it makes it easier for parents. I know in my own situation, being able to go into town, pick something up that I need at the same time I'm picking up my child is much easier than driving out of town, getting my kid, and then making a separate trip into town. And the local business people in New London recognize that as well. There's an issue about safety, that schools, the national something or other that has to do with school safety, really encourages schools to have naturalistic observation. What does that mean? That means that anybody can walk by and look in the school at any time and see what's going on. So that after school hours, if there's vandalism, it's much easier to see it rather than having scheduled patrols, or the patrol car pulls up in the parking lot with the lights on. Anybody in there kind of knows somebody's here. So having it be observable by normal people is considered to be very important. Schools and communities are consistent with federal and state mandates. They're centralized, accessible resources. Let me go back. And probably not as relevant here, but the idea of regional schools used to be thought of as a cost-efficient process. It's been recently shown that regional schools are very cost inefficient over the long term. There's also the issue of historic preservation. Seeing your school out here, I would think that would be somewhat of a priority here. So evidence is clear that from brain development to federal policy, environmental concerns, safety issues, and social capital, schools belong in communities. The question really should not be, where should we put a school, but why would we put it any place but within a community? So I'll take some questions now.
Thank you, Doctor. And at this point, I would like to take a moment to just remind the audience, we do certainly thank you and appreciate your participation by coming this evening, but the questioning this evening is going to be for the panel of city councilors and school board members here. That is not necessarily hard and fast, but we have a limited amount of time, and we do want to hear as well from the next individual, Elizabeth De La Valle. So with that, I'd be happy to direct some questions to Dr. Marylander. Christine.
Yeah,
Councilor Dwyer.
The early adolescent versus late adolescent, I'd be interested in hearing you talk about that because, you know, one of the things that I've heard people talking about both sides about, is it a good idea to have the younger adolescents in a similar location facility with older adolescents? Is it better to have them separated? Is there any research that suggests what the age mixes are here that are either optimal, or does it have anything to do with the issues that you've been raising?
There's no good research. It's difficult research to do. And it's really, as far as I can tell from looking at it, there's a new theory every 6 to 18 months, and schools try different things. I think what we're really talking about is behavior, not necessarily brain development, although brain development's going on, and there are the needs that younger adolescents seem to have relative to older adolescents has a lot to do with their physical abilities at that time, and I guess to some degree how well advanced their cognitive abilities are. So they're not as skilled, certainly, as older adolescents. But is it bad to mix them? In my view, no. What's bad is if they're not supervised appropriately. Will older adolescents take advantage of younger adolescents? Yeah, probably. I'm sure it happens.
Are the younger adolescents as thrill-seeking, maybe not as good at it, but are they as thrill-seeking as the older adolescents? It certainly doesn't seem that way, but...
Well, different thrills. I mean, I use the term thrill-seeking quite loosely. From a brain point of view, the brain is looking for stimulation, and what they need is stimulation. What they can handle is a lot different, and what their choices are different because of their younger age and what they're interested in. So as they get older and more physically adept at managing thrills, you see a tremendous increase in the pushing the envelope. So probably early adolescents aren't as interested in trying to do all the different drugs they can, although some of them seem to be, but trying to explore different relationships, trying to explore different ways of being. That's really starting at 11 and 12. They're not as good at it, and so it does look quite a bit different.
Questions from others for Dr. Mailander? Mitch Schultman.
Thank you very much. I actually think it was a great talk. I don't disagree with much at all of what you were saying. My question is, I'm curious for you to talk a little bit more about when you say the notion of isolating kids, and what does isolating mean? And does a school have to be in the center of downtown to be a center of a community? Because Portsmouth has 5 school buildings, 4 of which are not in the center of downtown, but they're in different parts of the town, and they have thriving communities in and of themselves. So if you could just talk about that, please.
Yeah, in some poetic license maybe here. I think what I want to highlight are the important concepts that kids be available not only for the community to see them, but for them to interact with the community. Being isolated, and I really don't know the entire situation here in Portsmouth, but in other districts where I've seen they've put schools literally out in the middle of nowhere, they're not isolated by the fact that there are other kids around, there are teachers there, there's certainly people there, but they're not a part of the fabric of the community. The school does not serve as an institution for the community. People have to drive out to it. They have to go out of their way. It's not really.
So if I could just, I suggest that's why you have that photo, because that really shows that's the isolation you're talking about in a extreme sense.
In an extreme sense. And so everything is relative. And there are situations where there are no other places. You have to put the school somewhere on the periphery or out in the edge. I think the issue I want to really bring up is that when you look at costs and benefits, some of the costs do not boil down to immediate dollars. That the social costs have to be considered as well. And those social costs are sometimes hard to pinpoint as well. But we do know that what's going on for kids today is that they do not seem to be as well connected. So looking at ways that we can connect kids back to communities, I think, is part of our job. And it just makes it easier when your school is local. Now that's local in a community. So that's the social argument. But as I started to get into and didn't want to go too far with, there are all these other issues around sprawl, pollution, busing, walking, economics that also play in here. And so when I looked at as much research as I could find, and this is very hard stuff to do good research on, but when I looked at all the information, I really did come to the conclusion of why would we put it someplace else? There might be a good reason for that, but in the district that I just came from, whenever I asked the question, I could never get an answer. There really wasn't. Well, because we want it there. It's new. I don't know.
I believe I saw Nancy Clayberg next.
Yes, Dr. Morlander. I have 3 teenagers. I was wondering if you ever come to people's houses and give them advice on how to raise their teenagers. One of them is sitting over there. Michael, say hi. I have a question. You mentioned that Kearsarge is in the process of building a new middle school, and they have decided to kind of go in the outer parts of the town. Is that correct?
It's not even the outer parts of town. It's out in, there's nothing nearby. It's
Okay.
way out. So it's a rather extreme case.
And then, am I right in that in Hanover, they just built a middle school that was kind of out of the center of the town?
It's out of the center of town, yes. It's still in an area that's part of the town, and there's residential development around it. Yeah.
So in those 2 situations, are you talking about locations that are far away? I mean, like how many miles from the center? When we're talking in Portsmouth here, these 2 locations that we're talking about really aren't that far away from each other. I mean, are they 2 miles away from each other? I don't even know if it would be 2 miles, maybe? Okay. So, I mean, are you talking about a great distance or?
Well, again, the absolute distance isn't probably the important variable here. It's the access to the community, not only for kids to have access to the community, but for the community to have access to the kids. In the Kearsarge situation, they've had the high school out in a very remote place. I don't know who any of those kids are. I'm in town every day dropping kids at the middle school. I know who those kids are just by seeing them. I have no high school kid could walk up to me and I would have no clue who he was. So that just tells me that there's really no connection to the community for those kids. Their parents know who they are, obviously, but it isolates them. It doesn't set up the opportunities for involvement. So, I'm not really here to argue Portsmouth's case. I guess I would say that if it were close enough that it was a part of the community, I mean, there are compromises that need to be made at times. That's clear. It's not an all or nothing thing. But when you have choices, I put my money on the side of put it in the community where you're going to maximize lots more than putting it outside the community where are you going to hurt kids? Well, who knows? But you're not giving them the opportunity or the adults the opportunity to interact with them. So you have to weigh all of that. But over and over again in other schools I've talked to, the social factors have never been considered. And this is educators who purport to know a lot about kids, and it has not been considered by some of those people that this is part of their education, being a member of a community.
If there may be others of you that have questions, and maybe we take 1 or 2 more questions, but at that point, if we could persuade Dr. Maylander to hang around until after Ms. Della Valle's talk, if there are other questions for you at that time, that might be appropriate. Is there, John Lyons?
Thank you. Doctor, I'm wondering, before this evening, did you have a chance to talk to the principal at the middle school here in Portsmouth or anybody in our education department?
No, I've spoken with nobody in Portsmouth other than getting here.
One of the things I'd love you to do, and I think it would fit in with your continued research, is all of these things that you talk about, we're doing. We talk about belonging, peer-to-peer mediation, and I was just wondering before you talk whether you had a chance to see how we do all of these things inside the building. You said that you had been contacted by an Eric. Can you tell me Eric who?
Spear.
Thank you. Have you been to this, do you know where the second site proposed, have you been there?
No.
Have you been to Portsmouth High School?
No.
Thank you.
No, I'm not here to argue for Portsmouth or against the position. I was asked to talk about the social impacts.
Appreciate it, and I did enjoy it. Thank you.
Dr. Mailander, we thank you very much. I would also ask if you have at this moment a website and/or email or some sort of contact. If we Google you, I'm sure we can find you. Okay, because I'm sure people may have questions. This is very, very informative for all of us. At this point in time, again, if we could ask you to hang around, we would now like to introduce, and if Councilor Dwyer is going to introduce Elizabeth Della Valle, take it away, Chris.
Okay. Beth Della Valle is going to come at some of these issues from a completely different perspective. She's been involved, as the last couple of questions have sort of suggested, lots of communities in New England have been challenged with this issue of where to locate a school, where to put a new school. Land is scarce in our communities. And as a planner, she's been involved in this issue in Maine and in New Hampshire from a number of different communities. And so we thought she would be an interesting person to talk about some of those examples that from the planning perspective, not from the school perspective or the medical or the social perspective. She was South Portland's city planner. She's been a planning consultant, and she worked for the Maine State Planning Office for a number of years. And at the Maine State Planning Office, she was director of the Maine Smart Growth Initiative. And it's the smart growth that really brings her here. As you know, that's something that our community, our planning board, has been interested in. Maine has been doing a great deal in all their communities with looking at smart growth and sprawl, looking at planning in a different way, looking at master planning in a different way than we have. And she's been particularly involved in American neighborhoods and what the great American neighborhood is, not only schools, but hospitals, civic institutions, post offices, libraries, et cetera. And so from the city planning perspective, we thought it would be helpful to have her talk. So, Beth?
Thank you very much.
I'm going to be talking about community as a physical community. Primarily as municipalities. This is a slide of the plan for Radburn, New Jersey, which is an icon of planning and of planned communities. I want you to take a look. Let's see if I can get this thing to work. I'm not real good at it. This point here, and this point here. Each of those areas is a school, specifically located at the center of a neighborhood so that every child would be within a 1/4 mile walking distance of what these are, elementary schools. I use this plan to point out that traditionally neighborhoods were proposed to be built around a school on purpose, even when communities like Radburn were purposefully designed as a suburb where human beings and cars could coexist. The Depression curtailed the dream of Radburn as an entire community. However, a portion of Radburn was built. And look what's in the middle of it. Right there. That's a school. This example illustrates the fact that until relatively recently, our society has not even thought about the relationship of schools and neighborhoods any other way. Schools were viewed as part of a neighborhood in which livability is defined by being able to walk to school. Even Frank Lloyd Wright, in his classic sprawling suburb, Broadacre City, understood this principle. Wright believed that the automobile was liberating and endorsed the idea of spreading out, with every lot being a minimum of 1 acre, Yet even in this autocentric pattern, schools are at its center. The concept of a school at the center of a community was just basic. I'm not sure when we lost this concept. I think it was probably somewhere in the early 1970s with two concurrent trends. The trend of urban flight and the first Earth Day, from which conventional wisdom suggested that an environmentally responsible community emerged to mean that everyone had to have a large lot with their home at its center. And basically that's what we've been building ever since, with schools on a whole different scale and with a whole different model than the pattern of history, at least in the U.S. and certainly in New England up to that point. This hasn't, however, excluded the fact that there is an opportunity to pursue a smarter way to grow and to sustain a community as an antidote to urban sprawl. Most of my talks are about suburban sprawl, but tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about urban sprawl. It's a model of community development that's different from the model of the last 45 years. One that's more consistent with the traditional patterns of New England communities, with schools as the traditional anchor of neighborhoods and downtowns, as a source of pride for the community. Schools can continue to form the core of our neighborhoods and downtowns by anchoring and sometimes restoring them. When existing schools must be replaced by a site that is amid a remote green field, they can serve as magnets for growth around which new neighborhoods can be built. However, when there's little land around the green field available for new residential development, they remain an important community institution, albeit isolated from the rest of the community. And we didn't talk ahead of time about our choice of words. They just seem to coincide here. Before the existing middle school, which helps define and is supported by Portsmouth community fabric, is relocated, it is incumbent upon the community leaders, and I include both the school board and the city council in that definition, to ensure that all options to accommodate school needs in its present location are thoroughly explored. As with most smart growth issues, the decision about whether to renovate or build a new middle school is complicated. School facility planners are struggling with fiscal efficiencies, student performance, programmatic changes over at least a 50 to 75-year lifetime of a school building, incremental changes in enrollment, both increases and decreases, and state acreage and classroom guidelines. Municipal leaders are faced with community stability, downtown and neighborhood vitality, short and long-term infrastructure and service costs, preservation of remaining valuable natural areas, and the overall health of the community. Well, I'm here as the bearer of bad news. There's no silver bullet to solve the dilemma that you're facing. Rather, the solution is likely to be found in a careful balancing of competing interests. Recognizing this, when I was with the State Planning Office in Maine, I worked with the State Department of Education to help communities facing similar issues to what you're facing. And we prepared a brochure to help communities and school boards grapple with the challenging issue. And this brochure, of which unfortunately I only have one copy, but I think you might still be able to get a copy at a nominal cost, I think it's something on the order of $1, from the Maine State Planning Office. It's called the ABCs of School Site Selection. Nice little piece. I'm just going to hold it up here for a moment. Talks about some of the general issues. Has a bunch of case studies for how different communities have handled it, and a nice little poster you can put on your wall with A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H, which I'm going to summarize tonight as an ABC. Be happy to share this if people want to take a look at it afterwards. I wanted to note that it was interesting that Hanover came up, because several years ago, the town of Hanover, New Hampshire, was facing a similar dilemma, a little bit different, but not too different than what you're facing. And at that time, I was invited to come to the town with a couple of other people in a community forum to make a presentation that is actually very similar to the one that I'm going to make this evening. Over the ensuing months, the town and the school district grappled with very similar issues to what you're facing. And they came to a solution that successfully brought school and municipal planners together in the interests of the overall good of the community. It was hard work, but they recognized that the decision they were making would have a long-lasting impact on the character of their community and school district, and was therefore worth taking the time necessary to craft a working consensus on how to proceed. Okay. Where your middle school is located matters. Why does it matter? It matters because, as I've already noted, schools are the heart of a community as well as centers of education. Siting decisions can cost or save money over the long term. The location of a school can reinforce or work against a community's plans for future growth and development, downtown vitality, and environmental sensitivity. And a school's location affects all citizens because it mirrors local values and pride. The ABCs of school site selection, and here we go, I'm going to talk from the brochure now. The ABCs of school site selection suggest that A, you avoid sprawl. First, consider renovation. In recent years, a number of organizations, including the National Association of Realtors, their local government commission of that association, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and the American Planning Association have prepared materials to aid communities and school districts in considering and evaluating renovation options. And you folks all have a copy of my PowerPoint plus my talk, so feel free to, everything I'm saying, except for when I go ad lib, will be in there. The renovation option probably will require consideration of a variety of standards and guidelines that are established for contemporary school construction. Now, some of these guidelines, like minimum acreages, classroom sizes, maximum renovation, new construction ratios, drive the need for larger facilities on larger sites that often cannot be accommodated in existing neighborhoods and downtowns. It's just the way it is. Furthermore, in exploring the renovation option, it would be wise to seek cost estimates from architects and engineers who specialize in school renovation, rather than relying on cost estimates that are generated by architects and engineers who are most often involved in new construction. Nothing wrong with either of those. It's just that because they have more experience in their respective fields, or their respective experience, the folks who are involved in the renovation side of schools are more likely to be familiar with both the opportunities and the pitfalls of renovation, of renovating older schools. I would encourage you to make sure that the existing and proposed new site is based on, I would encourage you to make sure that you analyze the existing and the new site based on proximity to existing services, the downtown, established neighborhoods, and opportunities for growth of new neighborhoods. Nearby community facilities like libraries, art centers, and museums can provide opportunities that might otherwise have to be provided by the school if it's located in a more remote location in the community. Similarly, when a school is within a community or within a developed part of the community where you've got a mix of land uses, the opportunity for service learning is just easier. It's not that you can't do it when the schools are in a more remote or a more isolated location. It just takes that much more effort. I'd encourage you to use caution in selecting a site that is located in the geographic center of a community. Although the site might be equidistant from the borders of the community, the potential for long-term operational costs is significant if the site is located away from services and more highly populated residential neighborhoods. B, Be site savvy. Site ancillary facilities like playing fields creatively. If an existing school is too small, consider siting playing fields on land that's close by. Don't give up a good site because it's too small for the entire project. Consider building up rather than out to help reduce site preparation costs and to maximize playing fields and open space. Consider limiting parking, especially for those who do not need to drive. A school that is located in a sea of parking looks like a big box store, a big box factory. It's less inviting to the community. Explore whether there are opportunities to share parking with surrounding businesses and institutional uses that are less active during late afternoon and evening hours when middle school parking may be at its highest. Investigate opportunities for off-site parking for school employees. It's not pleasant, but urban environments, and Portsmouth is an urban environment, are different than suburban environments where parking is at your doorstep. Consider nearby properties that might be acquired and recycled for some types of school functions so that you can basically expand your building. Avoid building in wetlands and fragmenting wildlife habitat. I encourage you to select a site where students can walk or cycle to school. Consider a site that is convenient for all modes of transportation. Over 50 to 75 years, somebody just pointed this out in the Maine State Pier proposal in downtown Portland a couple of weeks ago at a presentation I went to. In the 50 to 75 to 100-year life of the building, the mode of transportation is going to change. Building flexibility into your site selection will help you adapt over time to those changes in modes. Avoid sites that are only accessible by car or school bus, as they can increase long-term costs, increase environmental impacts, and reduce young people's opportunities to be physically active in their day-to-day lives. Childhood obesity has as much to do with limited daily mobility as it does with choosing video games over soccer and lacrosse. Consider the fact that people are most likely to walk to their destination if it's not more than 10 minutes away. Since most people tend to walk, and these standards, I have to tell you, are geared toward adults rather than young adolescents. But most people, most adults, tend to walk about 250 to 350 feet in a minute. So it's most desirable that the school be sited within 3,000 feet of a significant residential population. In addition to academics and physical activity, as young people grow, they require opportunities for independent activity in a safe environment, increasingly independent activity. Being able to walk unescorted to the dentist or to an after-school violin lesson is an important education to consider, along with reading, writing, arithmetic, and soccer. Utilize existing services and facilities and save money. If you select a site that is served by good roads, an existing sewer system, public water, three-phase power, nearby fire stations, public transit routes, and other essential services, you won't have to pay more to provide those. A site that requires extended utility services will have increased construction and long-term operational costs that divert precious and limited dollars that are available for the educational line item in the annual budget. Maximize site service costs. Design the site so that buildings can be sited close to the road. Avoid sites that require lengthy access ways and long utility runs. Extending utility lines or the provision of new on-site services like water and sewer or septic can take precious construction monies away from the facilities needs program. Transportation costs more for schools and for community members who end up driving further to attend school events. More driving means higher expenses, more air pollution, and the loss of valuable time. C, consult the community. Tap into community resources to help make and plan for this decision. Encourage broad participation. Invite local planners, landscape architects, engineers, and other professionals to help. It's crucial to involve the local planning board and other committee members as well as the general public in this decision-making process. Avoid hasty decisions and consult with experts. Obtain professional expertise and use a fair and equitable evaluation system that gives priority to the most important selection criteria. A sustainable and smart solution to the Portsmouth Middle School issue will require a commitment to 4 important principles. First, a dialogue between local school and planning interests, parents, the state, and many others. Articulation of a community's vision for its future. Research to identify and debunk, if appropriate, long-held assumptions and myths that dictate the form of our schools and communities. And finally, a commitment to creatively solve the problems that virtually every site and every situation will present. But the effort necessary to tackle this problem will pay off in building a better and healthier community. Here are some smart growth resources that you might investigate to help you in your endeavor. The first is a website for the National Association of Realtors, the Local Government Commission. There you can find a document that they put out called New Schools for Older Neighborhoods, Strategies for Building Our Community's Most Important Assets. The second is from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Again, a web link where you can download 2 reports, and I suspect there are more. Historic Neighborhood Schools in the Age of Sprawl, Why Johnny Can't Walk to School. Second, a community guide to saving older schools. The third site I would suggest you might want to check out is the American Planning Association. They have a Growing Smarter Legislative Guidebook, which talks more to the community side of the issue than the school side of the issue. And finally, the Maine State Planning Office, where you can either access on the web or for a nominal fee. Typically, it's just the cost of reproduction and mailing. To get a copy of the ABCs of School Site Selection, the cost of sprawl, and making schools important to neighborhoods again, in which case that last document is actually looking at, okay, so you've got to cite the school somewhere distant from the center of your community. How do you bring the community to the school? Maybe a little difficult for you folks because you don't have an awful lot of land left for a lot of new residential development, but still there's some tricks there to look at. Finally, I want to wish you good luck in your efforts. The task before you is significant, but one that's well worth engaging in. And if I can be of any further assistance, please don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. That was great. Questions for Ms. Della Valle? And what I would ask in the first instance is if you get your questions out for her in the first instance, and then after that, if we have any additional ones for Dr. Marilando, certainly we can ask him to step up. Nancy Claiborne.
Do you want other people to ask questions? I already asked one.
I think if you have your hand up, put your hands up, folks. Come one, come all. This is wide open.
I just have a question about kids walking to school. Last week in one of our newspapers, on the front page were 12 pictures of child predators. And I have 3 children that are now in high school and college, but in my elementary school was a quarter of a mile from my house. My children never walked to school unless I walked with them. They never biked unless I biked with them. And it was the same in my whole neighborhood. And now, I look at our middle school in its current location. There are 500 students. 185 don't have the bus service. The rest of the kids have the bus service, which means 300 and some odd kids take the bus. But of that 185, 32 walk. The rest of them, their parents drive them or a friend's parents drive them. I know me as a parent, I don't know how other parents here feel, I'm afraid to let my kids walk to school unless I'm with them, and I'm afraid to have them bike to school unless some adult is with them. So I don't know if it's just me or I see it in Portsmouth a lot. Like I just mentioned, 32 kids walk to the middle school every day, and that's it. So I guess I'm seeing personally a trend where kids aren't walking to school today. I mean, I think it's great if they did because of childhood obesity, and I know I've seen on the news communities where they get teams together and they all walk to school together, and maybe we could do that in Portsmouth, but it certainly isn't. I think it's a trend away from walking to school rather than a trend to walk to school.
I guess I would say that there's probably some reasonable reason for caution, and there's also probably some overreaction on the part of parents. And I think that there are strategies that communities can commit themselves to. There are organizations called Safe Routes to School that are emerging in a number of places. I think there is one in New Hampshire. I know that there is one in Maine. In Maine, it's sort of sponsored at a state level, but then it becomes very local. The state level is where you disperse information about things you might want to do, where you bring local groups together where they can learn from each other. Before I go further, I'm going to do sort of the standard trick on this. How many of you walk to school? Hands up.
How many of us walk?
How many of you folks walk to school?
Elementary, you mean middle, you mean high school?
Whatever.
Differs.
I mean, I walked to all three, although my high school was just a little over a mile away, and so I barely squeaked by to be able to take the bus on bad days. How many of your kids walk to school? Maybe a quarter of the number who raised their hands. This isn't unusual. No matter where I've gone in the state of Maine, the most rural communities to the most urban communities, I happen to live in Portland, it's the same. Everybody's experienced the same. And I guess in terms of this increasing level of independence, I see this as a real tragedy for our children. And I'm a mother. I have a 17-year-old and I have a 20-year-old. So I get to, I'm on the end of this. Somehow it seems to me that we've got to figure out how to make it safe for our kids to be on their feet and on their bikes in the streets of our communities. If we can't, what a sad commentary. We are dooming our children to be fearful individuals. We are dooming them to inactivity except on a sports field. And how many kids, once they're out of high school or college, have the option of being a member of a team, playing a team sport? It's a whole way of orienting ourselves. And it's not just our kids. We don't walk either. I guess I would argue that the fabric of our community, the physical form of our community, has something to do with that. I would also say that it's safer to walk in a place where there are people and frequent activities than it is for them to be walking in a place that's out of the community's eyes, away from the community's eyes.
Thank you. I saw Councilor Smith, and then I saw school board member. Wait a minute. Then Clay Hayward is first, then Councilor Smith.
Mine is on this specific.
All right. If you would be so kind as to
just for a second, just want to make a quick comment. As chairman of the Traffic and Safety Committee, we have set up a subcommittee of safe routes to school. At our next city council meeting, we will be taking that up to become a formal committee to create a smart safe routes to school program within the city of Portsmouth. I know part of that, we've put a request out that there'll be, hopefully someone from the school board will be sitting on that committee with us. I know Dr. Lister is shaking his head yes, so I know that request has gone through. So that is something that is, we as a city council and as Traffic and Safety Committee are taking up to hopefully institute that and get that going here within the city. Thank you.
Carson.
Thank you.
Sorry,
Beth, on your
Clay.
second slide, yes.
No, sorry.
That's all
Let's
right.
start with C.
On your second slide, you had a diagram of the town of, was it Radbury?
Radburn.
Radburn?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm I'm not sure what their situation was, what their school boards were thinking at the time of the new buildings of the schools. But it looks like the schools were strategically put in certain sections of the city. And I'm not sure when each school was built, and I'm assuming they're all new now?
No, actually, Radburn was what's called a new town. It was a fully designed community. It was designed in the 20s. It fell upon, the late 20s. It was impacted by the Depression. Okay, so it began to be developed, but was never fully realized as it was planned. I just actually heard on the radio the other day, or actually I think I saw it in a newspaper article from the Post, that Radburn is actually looking at modifying again some of his plans. So it's an active community now. Part of it was designed and built as proposed. It was a community where, even though it was seen as a suburb and was very auto-oriented, they had separate circulation systems. So they had car circulation systems and pedestrian and bicycle circulation systems. And the idea was that they crossed at important junctures, but they could operate separately. Is Radburn today, I mean, are they looking at building new schools? They're probably starting to face it, and it'll be interesting to see what they do.
Okay. By looking at the diagram, it almost looked like that the schools were purposely set out to the side as if they were like all alone within their own area of the town. But actually, if you look at it closely, you see a lot of open space there.
Sure.
And it looks like each school has its state requirements for ball fields. The football fields for the middle school and the high school?
I would guess it wouldn't meet contemporary standards. It probably, because remember, this is a suburban community. They were intending to design this to include a lot of green area. Portsmouth is a lot older. I think what you were seeing in the other slide was a school with a part of a neighborhood that developed. And in fact, what happened was the school was at the juncture of separate little developments. And so if you go to the next slide, this area hadn't yet developed, nor had this area or the area over here. But the idea was to put it at the center so that as many kids as possible could get to it conveniently. And again, they did wonderful things with their sidewalks and bridges, and so that the kids wouldn't have the conflict with cars.
Right.
Thank you. Now, so that I have this right, do you have another question?
Yes.
Okay, follow up. Go ahead.
It also looked like that, like what you just said, that the schools were put in areas where it would almost be centralized so that children would be able to walk to school. Okay, that's great. Of course, there's an issue with parking, but I think they almost took care of that as well with the amount of land that they have for each site, except for the one that's down in the center of Radbury. Let's see, what else did I also wanted to touch upon? How many students are also?
Again, I can't answer at this point. My guess is that since we're talking in the Mid-Atlantic area, you're looking at probably what were relatively large schools at that time, but our trends have changed so much over the years. I mean, it used to be, that 300 students in an elementary school was enormous. Now we regularly see 700 kids at elementary schools.
Okay.
So my point in showing this was not that this is a contemporary model.
Okay. All right. Okay, thank you.
Any further questions, Clay?
No.
Okay. Then we had John, Christine, and then I think I saw Kent LePage. And may I say, it's almost 8. Certainly 8 is not by any means cast in stone, but if we get to the end of the questions for Beth, then there might be questions for both as well.
Ms. Della Valle, thank you for your presentation. I loved your slide on sustainable and smart solutions and the 4 bullet points that you had there. was near the end, if you could find that. I think that's great. The only thing I would do is my first bullet point up there would be put the kids first, because that's what it's all about. All of these other issues are very important, but buildings and sites and all of that really come in second. We have to remember that this is about the kids, at least from my perspective. Back when we walked to school, and I was born and raised here in Portsmouth, there were probably 8 elementary schools, and there were grocery stores. There wasn't supermarkets. There was so it was a different world we lived in.
Absolutely.
Can't afford that anymore. And a lot of the things that it seems to me that you talk about are more applicable to elementary schools, and here's the reason why. If you have a community like Portsmouth and have 3 elementary schools, it's easier to site them in communities and make them so that children can walk to them. When you have a single high school or a single junior high school, some of these issues you talk about have to be compromised. Particularly, one of the maps that you showed was where the present middle school is and where you put the new middle school. Population centers have changed. If on that map you actually had the elementary schools, both of the sites are pretty centrally located for access to parents to get to them. So they're not in a geographic center, but they are in a center of where the population centers are. So it's just my observation that, you know, some of these things are a little easier with elementary schools than one single school.
It is, but it's still not impossible. I'm from Portland. In Portland, there were many more elementary schools when I was a kid because our population has our school-age population has declined and is still projected to decline. They're actually now talking about closing even more of them. My elementary school, which is 2 blocks away from where I live, which is where I grew up, is closed. It's now administrative offices. English as a second language is also taught there because we have an emerging, a growing immigrant community. There were probably 5 what were junior high schools when I went to school and that are now middle schools, and there are 2 with a new high school that have come on as an experiential high school, sort of the Outward Bound model. All of those are still located in the midst of residential neighborhoods. All of them have a certain number of students who are bused. All of them also have a lot of parents who are dropping their kids off because they've trained us very well. So yes, I would say that the quarter-mile walking distance model, when you design a community, does talk most directly to the elementary population. By the time they hit high school, they're in a whole nother time zone. You know, they don't want to be seen walking. God forbid they go on a bicycle. When they're finally, you feel like they're finally able to go on a bicycle and be safe, they no longer want to do it.
They don't even want to ride on the bus. They want their own car.
Exactly, exactly. And maybe even parents dropping them down the street around the corner so they're not embarrassed by having us around. But at the middle school, that's still a tipping point where they're not quite children, but they're not quite adolescents, or as you get into the older years, the 8th grade, you know, they really are sort of moving toward the adolescent. But at the 6th and 7th grade level, they still are forming their decisions about mobility. And you know, the obesity standards, the health issues are just staggering. And while I don't think it's going to be an easy fit, I think it's something that we as community leaders need to grapple with. Now, one thing I need to say is I'm not pushing one choice or another. What I'm really pushing here is that dialogue and assessing what the most critical issues are associated with decision, getting some true costs in place, not just the short-term costs, but the long-term costs, not just the fiscal costs, but the social costs. And putting your heads together as community leaders to figure out the best way of balancing it. It's not by accident that I chose this kind of ugly background here. Those are scales. it's a balancing process that you have to go through as a community. And getting together, talking about that, and putting it out there for conversation so that the community can engage, both you as well as the larger community, and be thoughtful in your deliberations is probably the most important thing I want you to take away from my talk.
Thank you.
Councilor Dwyer, then Chairman LePage.
Well, I don't know if I qualify to ask a question since I rode a bus to school since starting at age 3 to preschool, but you mentioned and you said it might be difficult in this community, but the how to bring a community to a school, the phrase at the end of, if you can't really, for whatever reason, locate a school more in the center of the community, what are some things that you can do to bring a school to a community? And, I understand that it may be hard to answer that given that we're not talking about a lot of buildable land for building a development around the school, but are there other things that you can think of within that bring a school to a community, or other examples you can point us to?
I would say
bring a community to a school, rather.
Sure, and this is critical because in Maine, when we were going out and talking with communities and trying to get them to engage both the municipal leaders and the school planners together, recognizing that they both had a significant stake in the outcome. Many schools in rural Maine in particular are multi-town school districts, and so they're thinking, oh boy, let's just site this out at the intersection of all 4 towns that are in our school district. Or they're facing population growth, and if they were lucky enough to have a traditional center, they couldn't fit the schools in. The sites weren't big enough that were available. Assembling sites and taking down buildings just would have been astronomical, both in cost and in terms of difficulty. And so we really focused on this issue of, okay, so if you have to site it away, how do you bring the community to school? Well, the first and foremost, you got to allow residential development around it, and you got to allow it at a density that is going to be it's going to bring as many people in there as you can, as the area can support. So you don't want to be zoning the area around there for 2 and 4 acre lots, which is what happens in these rural communities. Probably here you might be talking about 20,000 square foot lots and 1 acre lots. You want to allow potentially multifamily housing, not just single family housing. You want to have a mix of uses so that kids have the opportunity to experience, maybe not at the density of what you see in the downtown, but certainly some stores, some businesses, hopefully some institutional uses, churches, nursing homes. And I know that there's a nursing home near both of the sites that you're looking at. That's some of the ways that you can bring it in. You're going to be in a tough spot because you don't have a lot of land. But being creative and efficient about the use of the land would help address some of that issue.
Ken?
First of all, I apologize that Dr. Lister and Steve Bartlett and myself were late, and I know Nancy said that we were at a meeting. But that actually leads, and I want to say that on my way to the meeting with the SAU 50, our sister district, I heard on WTSN through the Portsmouth Herald reporting that this was going to be a shootout, and I want to say how wrong they were. I want to thank Councilor Dwyer, City Manager Bohenko. Instead of a newspaper trying to make news, take it home that we're here to having a good dialogue. And I really do want to thank you for the open dialogue that we're having. They're dead wrong. A couple of things that come to mind here. One is, just to get a background, Mr. Valley, in Maine, how many schools did you ever do any schools planning like this in districts on out there? And are there any examples? Because one comes to mind that I thought you may have had. Did you work on the town of Rangeley renovation?
Not in Rangeley. Let me give you just a little bit of background. What we did with this initiative between the State Department of Education and the State Planning Office is we teamed up. They were finding, clearly there were more school construction and renovation needs than there were dollars to support.
Remember, Maine was supporting 100% of renovation, so it bubbled up really fast.
Real fast. Actually, it was 100% of new construction. Renovation did not get as fair a hearing. And it actually took a change in the state rules to get that on the radar screen. And even now, many years later, it's not getting as much financial support as new construction is, which is unfortunate. But what we found is that it was very contentious. It was contentious at the municipal level because in Maine you're required to have 2 public hearings before on the specific site before the state would invest its dollars, and then you have to have referendum.
Mm-hmm. That's what
and
I
so
know that through the
they would go through 2, 3, 4 years of planning and get shot down. And so there was that issue. There was the issue that we were also seeing these enormous schools, almost Taj Mahals. I hope you won't take offense at that term, but it was out of control. There weren't any state standards about how much money they would invest. And so some schools that were very proactive were providing incredible facilities. And they were providing them out in green fields at the same time that municipalities were not allowing reasonable development around those schools. And so the State Department of Transportation was paying a fortune for roadway improvements that had to be made after the fact. That the environmental community, Department of Environmental Protection, was very upset because we were seeing not only development in inappropriate locations, but then we were seeing sprawl around it. The land was being gobbled up with 2 4-acre minimum lot sizes. Nobody could walk. Everybody had to be bused. Parents were going crazy because there weren't after school buses, and so everybody had to drive in addition to all the buses having to go there. Okay, so what we did is we set up this relationship. Once the school had been put on the list that the state said, yes, we will fund this, the first thing they had to do, they were required under their rules to do an assessment as to whether they could renovate first, because that was where they wanted to first put their money, was renovation rather than new school construction. Then, as part of, once they made the decision, well, as they were beginning to make that decision, as well as potentially looking at new sites, the state planning office, the land use team, which I was the director of, went out to meet with the communities. And essentially what we did is we called the communities up, and usually they were school construction committees or school boards. And we asked them to invite the municipal officials, whether they were town councilors or selectmen, to come to a meeting with us. And we went, and basically we presented this. We sent this to them ahead of time, and then we presented this, and we talked with them about their options, much like I'm doing here. And then we said, you can call us if you have some questions or you need some additional resources, either us at State Planning Office or this person at the Department of Education, and we will be happy to be a resource to you. And through that, people then went along the way and they made their decisions as to whether to renovate or do new construction, and if they did new construction, how to go about selecting a site. My team, which was made up of 6 people, and we already did our work in different regions of the state, did these meetings with the communities in our region. So my region was was the York County and a little piece of Cumberland County region. So I was in southern Maine.
Just 2 quick things.
I'm going to pass this around. These are some examples.
That'd be great, because I'd like to get a copy. One is, what is your feeling, because we do have one town that tuitions in to the middle school. We have SAU 50 that tuitions into our high school, but one that does. Should they not be a key part of the discussion and decision-making on that? Should not the town of Newington have, especially where we get reimbursed at a higher rate if they stay with us under our area agreement through the state?
Do they go to your middle school or just your high school? Your middle school.
They go to both.
That's a decision for you to make. If you want to continue to have tuitioned students and are going to be the primary resource for those communities, I'd say the more the better.
So you would say it has an importance?
Oh, I think so. Let me talk about Hanover. Hanover is a 2-town school district.
Right.
One town is in New Hampshire. The other town, Dresden, is in Vermont. Dresden residents were at that meeting in Hanover, and some of them actually said, you know, we'd rather have, and in this case they were talking about the need to expand the high school. The high school was next door to what I thought was an elementary school, but it might have been a middle school. And what they ultimately decided to do, rather than relocating the high school and the middle school, or whatever that additional school was, out to a site that was about 2 or 3 miles outside of the town. maybe it was a mile. They decided to expand the high school into the adjacent either elementary or middle school and to relocate that elementary or middle school to another area. And then the town made sure, as it was doing its comprehensive plan, to designate that area around it to allow for a neighborhood to develop around it. The people in Dresden came forward at that meeting and said, you know what, we'd much rather have the school be in the downtown because we know that our kids will have a safe place to go if I can't get there to pick them up right away. And gee, when I go pick them up, I also can do some shopping or other kinds of business. So just because other towns are involved in the decision-making doesn't mean that they necessarily will be adverse or supportive of one location or another.
I would agree. One thing, I'd like to go back to the slide that you had for Mr. Lyons up there a few minutes ago.
Which one?
The city of Portsmouth, where the two sites of the school. I don't know where this comes from, but there are three drastic mistakes within this map. One is the newest, largest development, Tidewash, in the city of Portsmouth is missing, which is a population area. And then our largest single apartment complex seems to be missing off this map, along with the high school complex seem to be missing from here.
No buildings on that diagram.
I'm not saying buildings, I'm saying roadways.
No
and
buildings
so,
on there.
I didn't say, I'm saying in here that there are roadways here that seem to be missing on this. You would think that this was a very sparse area, and it is remote to a small degree coming off onto Sagamore Creek, but again, there are roadways that are missing on that.
Yeah, and I apologize. I mean, I couldn't get down here to do the kind of site-specific investigation that needed to be done, so I had to take what I could access online.
And then lastly, Nancy brought up a good, not her, though when she did mention it, riding a bike, I'd like to see Nancy riding the bike to school. Went through my head. But is that safety is a concern, and we don't have to go far, and it's a number of years ago now, but there was a young lady, Tammy Belanger, on her way through the Exeter school system in a very populated area. It does happen, no matter what safety guards we put up there.
Yep.
And it is something that, until Nancy brought it up tonight, I hadn't thought as much about it. And all of a sudden I thought about, the months that went searching for a young lady that never was found. It does happen. So it is a consideration that until tonight I had not given it as much merit.
And I think it probably happens in both urban and rural environments. I mean, our kids are at greater risk than they probably, I don't know if they're greater than it's ever been, but it certainly is more publicized.
Publicized, I think.
And it is incumbent on all of us to make sure our kids are safe.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Now, at this point, I think Councilor Whitehouse had a question, and let me just hasten to add that it's my understanding that both Dr. Maylander and Liz Della Valle are donating their time, for which we thank them, and Dr. Maylander, I suspect, has to drive back to Hanover. So if we have a question, Councilor Whitehouse, please ask it, and then we'll open it up to Dr. Maylander as well, and on we go.
Thank you very much, Ms. Della Valle, for coming down. We really appreciate this. I'd like to follow up in reference to the referendum question on the ballot in the state of Maine. Now, do you know of any community in the state of New Hampshire whereby the elected bodies could not decide, and after many meetings of informational meetings and seminars and work sessions to let the public know both sides of the story, a simple referendum question was put on the ballot to make a decision? Do you know of any community?
I'm not familiar enough with the goings-on in New Hampshire, I'm sorry. You'd probably be better to send that kind of question to your State Department of Education.
Right.
It's a good one.
With that, do we have any questions for Dr. Maylander? Do we have any more questions for Liz Della Valle? Okay, since I have heard none, I would like to again express thanks on behalf of all and sundry that those were fantastic presentations. We may well follow up with you, and we do appreciate your time greatly. We do not take for granted that you have done this gratis, and we appreciate your community spirit in sharing that with us. Thank you all very much. Good night.